Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here today. I understand this is an unusually large crowd for the World Bank, and I know it's because of this fabulous report that is out, Voice and Agency, which is hot off the presses. I'm Isabel Coleman, and it is with great pleasure that I'm here to help launch this report. The World Bank has been such a thought leader on these issues for so long, and in fact, it was a World Bank report more than a decade ago, Engendering Development, that really got me deeply engaged in the issues around girls and women's empowerment. And this report breaks new ground in many ways for the bank, touching upon some very challenging issues about voice and agency. And of course, we have a remarkable group of experts here today to discuss the report. Secretary Clinton, Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo Msuka, and President of the World Bank, Jim Kim. We are going to have a conversation among this expert panel of really world leaders on this topic. But before we dive into that, I welcome Jenny Klugman to come up here. Jenny is the Director of Gender and Development at the World Bank and truly the driver behind this fabulous report. Jenny.
Thank you, Isabel. Expanding the voice and agency of women and girls is integral to the global development agenda. When women and girls are able to speak up and be heard and to make decisions that matter to them, their families, their communities, and their nations, everyone benefits. This is the main headline coming out of the report that we're launching this afternoon. The report distills vast data and hundreds of studies. In the few minutes I have now, I'll focus on just three messages: why it matters, what is the scale of the challenge, and what we can do. Agency is about people being able to make decisions that matter to them, about their lives, their families, their communities, and their countries. Today, we're focusing on girls and women, many of whom have no say over whether, when, and how many children to have, who are unable to buy or inherit land, who have no real say in decisions at home and in their community, and who, in their hundreds of millions, have been battered by their husbands. These are deprivations of agency that violate basic human rights and which hold back development. In a very basic sense, this is not new, even if still somewhat controversial in some parts of the World Bank. Indeed, 188 states have ratified the 1979 Convention that outlaws discrimination against women, and 75 countries have constitutions that prohibit discrimination by gender. So what are these deprivations, and why do they persist? Let me briefly highlight the most egregious gaps exposed by the report. In most of the world, no place is less safe for a woman than her own home. The map shows regional rates of violence inflicted by intimate partners, which reach as high as 43% in South Asia. Worldwide, more than 1 in 3 women have been subject to physical or sexual violence, and in the vast majority of cases, this is at the hands of their husbands or boyfriends. The numbers are horrifying, amounting to close to the total population of sub-Saharan Africa and almost triple the population of the US. Too many women lack sexual and reproductive rights. Annually, in developing countries, about 80 million women have pregnancies that were unintended, that they'd wanted to delay or not have at all. And way too many girls are wives and mothers. Rates of child marriage are as high as 3 out of 4 in Bangladesh. And in developing countries, pregnancy-related causes are the largest cause of death among girls who should be at high school, not in a maternity ward or dead. These statistics reflect enormous personal tragedy and suffering. And while human dignity is priceless, we now also know that intimate partner violence costs about 1.5% to 2% of GDP. Ministers of Finance, Health, and even Defence all need to know that gender violence stunts economic growth, just like trade sanctions, disease outbreaks, and wars do. Given such costs, why do such widespread breaches of rights persist? Our major finding is that bad outcomes are being driven by regressive social norms and restrictive laws. Our report documents the prevalence of social norms that act against women, using such key proxies as women lacking say over major household spending, thinking it's okay to be beaten by their husbands, and whether they were married as children. The Venn diagram illustrates that almost 4 out of 5 women globally face at least one of these constraints, and that more than 1 in 8 experience all 3 at the same time. And behind the global picture, the case is even worse in some countries. In Niger, nearly every single woman experiences at least one of these constraints, and almost half are subject to all 3. There are deep links to poverty and other sources of disadvantage. Poverty increases gender gaps. Girls from poor families are more than twice as likely as their richer peers to marry young. Intimate partner violence is much more frequent in poorer households, from India to Nicaragua. And in Australia, Aboriginal women are 5 times more likely to suffer domestic violence and 10 times more likely to die than non-Indigenous women. Another set of powerful new results link agency deprivations to the lack of education. This picture depicts that women with only primary schooling are much more likely to suffer agency deprivations than those who finish high school. We find that globally, 9 out of 10 university graduates say they can refuse sex, but only 7 out of 10 women with primary education can do so. And in countries with high rates of child marriage, girls with little schooling are up to 6 times more likely to marry young than girls who finish high school. So what can we do to make a difference? These challenges require changes in attitudes by all of us, women and girls, boys and men around the world. It's our behaviours and actions that shape the outcomes and discrimination that we see. It's a daunting agenda that's long-term in nature, but where there are major opportunities for quick wins as well. And the good news is that social norms about gender can and do change. Take girls' education, for example, where over the last decade, the gender gap has been rapidly closing. The government has a critical role to play in establishing progressive laws, in testing and delivering services and interventions to close gaps, supported by partners like the World Bank, and working with parliaments and civil society to help hold us all to account. A strong legislative response is a critical first step. Well into the 21st century, discriminatory laws remain way too pervasive. 128 countries have legal barriers to women in such basic areas of life as obtaining an ID card, owning property, or getting a job. In 28 countries, mainly in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, there are more than 10 such discriminatory laws on the national books. Progressive laws and their enforcement are needed to help create change. And change can happen, as we show in the report. Just one example. In recent decades, the number of countries outlawing domestic violence has risen from close to 0 to 76. Changing norms requires broad-based participation in the change process. Men and boys, community leaders, and family elders can be key allies. Indeed, programs that target and engage only women will bring only partial results. The report shows interventions need to engage boys early and highlight success stories from around the world, from Brazil to Burundi and Malawi. And in preventing violence, we find that the most promising interventions have multiple prongs and deliberately address norms. They involve the wider community and span long time periods. In this way, SASA in Uganda has mobilised community and halved rates of partner violence. There are major implications for our work. including on education, on social protection, and on jobs. Indeed, expanding women's economic opportunities is one of the most visible and game-changing ways to affect norms and expand agency. I saw this last week in Rwanda, where I talked to adolescent girls in our vocational training program, whose lives had been so seriously disrupted by the genocide, and who spoke to the ways in which the training was increasing their confidence, expanding their aspirations, as well as their incomes. And in all this, amplifying voices is critical, not least through collective action and women's groups who work so tirelessly for change. And finally, change also requires more and better data and new measures to track progress, so we can learn when we're making a difference, so we can be held to account. I know this is an issue close to the Secretary's heart. As she has so eloquently said, data not only measures progress, it inspires it. The report we're launching today demonstrates that voice matters, agency matters. When women and girls can make meaningful choices, where they can make their voices heard, everyone gains. Ensuring that they can is simply the right thing to do. That we have such a distinguished panel here today reflects both the importance and the urgency of this endeavour. I thank you for your time, and I know we all look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much, Jenny. That is a terrific overview of this very important report. And the report is so interesting because it really gets at the crux of the issue, which is norms. And the norms that hinder women, that regulate women, that limit their opportunities. And Secretary Clinton, you have spent so much of your life fighting to improve opportunities for women around the world. When it comes to norms and changing norms, what have you seen that's been most effective?
Well, thank you, Isabel, and thanks to Jenny and everyone here at the World Bank for continuing this very important work that you have done, looking at development through a gender lens and realizing and helping the rest of us to follow along how important the mission of the bank depends on moving toward gender equality and the removal of legal and regulatory restrictions, as well as the changing of social norms. And of course, I'm delighted to be here with my three colleagues on the stage. Let me just answer that in three ways. First, to begin really with what Jenny said. First of all, we need good data, and it's been a long time coming. Many of us, and I look around the audience, have made the case on behalf of women's equality on a moral, humanitarian, rights-based, human rights base for a number of decades. And I think we have helped to set the table for the discussion we're having today. But all too often, the gains that were realized from that argument were not on as strong a foundation as they needed to be because we didn't have data. And part of the reason we didn't have data is that for too long, too many places didn't collect data about girls and women. It's really remarkable that even in our own country, it wasn't that long ago before we didn't even test drugs and medical interventions on women, only on men, and then tried to extrapolate. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon that we've begun to develop the methods for collecting the data that illustrate what the gaps are between the treatment of boys and girls, men and women. Now, secondly, that then has given us a much stronger foundation on which to make arguments. It has also opened up new areas of analysis and persuasion. Certainly the economic arguments, which are highlighted in this book, linking, for example, domestic violence and the decrease in GDP to that particular problem could not have been possible because we weren't looking for the information, we weren't drawing the conclusions. So we're now building on a much stronger foundation in order to be able to make the case as to why women's equal, full participation, their voice and agency is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing, and that it will make a difference to the prosperity and stability of societies. And finally, when it comes to social norms, this is a long, slow process because even when we change laws, which we've seen quite a bit of, as we just heard, particularly since the UN conference in 1995, very often those laws are not enforced, they're not implemented, and they don't reach norms. And one of the points Jenny made, which I want to underscore, is you cannot change norms if you're only talking to women and girls about changing the norms that restrict their voice and agency. You have to broaden that conversation. That's where the data comes in. I've had countless conversations with heads of state, heads of government, other high-ranking officials, and not just governmental ones, people in economies, in religious leadership, and the like. And I have to be very honest, oftentimes talking about these issues caused eyes to roll. Like, you know, just could see them saying, oh yeah, okay, when is this gonna be over? When do we get on to the important stuff? You know, let's talk about building a power plant, just to pick one example. And instead now, when you go in and you say, let me show you what you're losing. What is the opportunity cost? Because you have failed to address these social norms. The other part of the argument is, in practically every country I'm aware of, the leaders often move away from social norms when it comes to their own daughters. They're extremely proud of their daughters who go to Oxford or Harvard. They're proud of their daughters who are in business or the professions, but they do not go beyond that. So they've broken the social norm on an exceptional basis, and that gives you an opening to make the argument not just for your daughter, but for your country's daughters, and begin to make that case.
Mzile, empowering women and girls was a key focus of the MDGs. Reducing maternal mortality, getting girls in school, and just generally empowering women and girls as a recognition of the central role it plays in poverty reduction. What do you hope for in the next set of development goals and how it relates to women and girls?
Thank you very much. I'm hoping that we can marry what we have discovered from the data generated by the MDGs, that development does work, but also that development doesn't work fully if it is not aligned with rights. Something that was emphasized very strongly in the Beijing platform. It was much stronger on the rights. In the MDGs, we were much stronger on development, and I think the separation of the two has meant that we've lost traction. What we hope to do post-2015 is to bring back both rights and development to the center, and to ensure that we also bring together the different agendas. 15 years after 2015, will be 30 years after Beijing. It is also 2030, the year when we hope to have done a lot of work on the reducing extreme poverty. We could align reducing poverty with investing in women, because one is a necessary condition for the other. And therefore, we could actually collaborate and partner better across the board. As far as UN Women is concerned, the issue of education, especially secondary education and beyond, is critical. We have to make sure that we use the data that the report generates that shows that if girls stay in school longer, we reduce diseases, we empower them, we reduce gender-based violence, et cetera, et cetera. So these challenges that we have got answers, and the data has given us the answers, and we need to implement access to reproductive health services and reproductive rights. critical, that coupled with education for us to ensure that it is well situated in the post-2015 agenda. And the utilization of the limited resources as means of implementation. Government budgets, even before we go to ODA, we need efficient expenditure of government monies in poor countries. Hence, ourselves and the World Bank, we are pushing for gender-responsive budgeting because that is efficient spending of limited resources so that you gain better impacts from limited resources.
Thank you. President Kim, the report really gets at discrimination and discrimination against women and girls, but there's a lot of discrimination in the world. Women and girls often bear the brunt of it in countries, but how do you think about that as a topic across the bank's work today?
You know, it's a hard topic, and let me start with this notion of social norms. You know, I'm an anthropologist, and I've studied culture my entire life, and what we have to be very careful about, and this is why voice and agency is so important, that what one group says is a cultural norm is not necessarily what all the groups will say is the cultural norm. And so what culture is used for is a way of justifying very unequal power relations. So you have to look for the power relations behind these declarations of culture. You know, I was born in Korea in 1959, and development economists were saying in 1959 that because of the rigid Confucian hierarchy where women had no role in society, there would be no chance for Korea to develop economically, and we know what happened. And a huge part of it was that women began working, and women drove the economic miracle. Here's the really great thing. You know, as an institution, I think we have to stand up and say that we are against discrimination against people because of who they are, whether it's because they're women, whether it's because they're a particular ethnic group, whether they are a sexual minority of some type. We have to stand up for it. But then the levers that we have, you know, we are not a political organization. So the great thing is that the evidence is in so many ways caught up with our deepest moral convictions. Now, you know, we just have some very straightforward data. If the women's low economic participation in the Middle East and North Africa created income losses of 27%. You know, if we could equalize female employment in South Asia, average income would go up 19%. The numbers are really clear. Discrimination is bad for economic growth. Now, what we can do then is continue to put this evidence in front of the world. That discrimination against women is bad in so many ways. You know, the data that Jenny presented about domestic violence is crushing. But what we know is that if laws are enacted to make domestic violence a crime, women are less willing to accept that domestic violence is a natural part of what they have to face. So get the data out in front of people, and on our part, what we can say over and over and over again is we're against discrimination against women. But moreover, you are missing a huge opportunity if you don't act now to put better policies in place, to really encourage the participation of women, to do all the things that are clearly outlined in Voice and Agency that will lead to a vision of society that once they can get their heads around it, once they see that it's happening in other places, I think they will embrace. Our job is to continue to put the information up, is to continue to count and give people data about how they're doing. And we need to make our own investments. We need to look at our entire portfolio and making sure that we are investing in countries in a way that will enhance women's participation, not only because it's the right thing to do morally and as human beings, but because it's the right thing to do to grow the economy.
Can I just ask you, when you're talking about these issues of discrimination and ultimately changing norms, I mean, it can engender a backlash. Do you see that in some of the countries in which you're working?
You know, it's always a very difficult line. It's always a very difficult issue to tackle. And you know, I recently made my opinion very clear about discrimination against the LGBT community. And we held up a loan, a credit, to Uganda because we wanted to make absolutely sure that the support for the health clinics that were a part of this loan would not end up in not only discrimination, but we feared that it could end up in endangerment of the LGBT community. And so we're now studying it, and we're in conversations with the Ugandan government. And there's been backlash on several levels, even in some major publications. But here's the point. I think that within the responsibilities and articles of agreement that we live under, we still have to stand for something. And we have to stand for the fundamental idea that discrimination because of who you are is not something that we at the World Bank Group should tolerate inside the programs we support. Now, Secretary Clinton said it just right, that the larger change in social norms will take time, but we have to start today any way that we can possibly raise the question of, of why are you discriminating? And in fact, if you discriminate in the context of programs we support, we have to look again. So it is difficult, it is tough, but I think the question here is for us, no matter how diverse the voices are inside the group, we really have to stand on the right side of history.
Could I just add, Isabel, too? I think there's a role to be played by institutions and individuals. I mean, obviously, the three of us have a platform, even a microphone to some extent. And very often these social norms cannot bear the light of day. They are carried on because they've always been carried on. So, for example, when as Secretary of State, I went to Papua New Guinea, which has one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the world. We briefed the American press traveling with me that this was a problem. It was a problem that I was going to raise with the then leadership because we saw it exactly as has been described as an obstacle to economic growth and development. I raised it with the then Prime Minister, who could have cared less about, hearing it in a private, closed meeting. And then during the press conference, one of the American reporters asked, well, how do you explain you have this very high rate of domestic violence? He was forced to respond publicly. And his response was along the lines of, well, there's really not that big a problem. Sometimes men come home and the dinner's not ready and they have a right to express their displeasure. And eyes were just popping open, not just from the Americans in the room, but others, because it was like, you're not supposed to go public about this. And eventually, when a new government came in, the new prime minister apologized to the women of Papua New Guinea because that was so embarrassing. So it's a constant struggle, but it's one that there are many different ways to participate in, and leaders, whether here at the bank or at the UN or in governments, can push for these issues to be raised publicly, because it's very difficult to justify in public what are these social norms that have just been accepted over so many years. And that begins to build a constituency internally and externally to change those norms.
When you had that conversation with the Prime Minister, did you have a number, like is in this book, quantifying the economic impact of that violence against women?
We didn't have this data, but we had that, I think, and I'm looking at Milan Verveer, who was our global ambassador here in the front rows, I think it was half the women in the country. It was a very high percentage. And we then made the argument that, it was bad for the economy, it was bad for the stability of society. Now, with this information, it's even a much stronger argument because you can quantify it in terms of gross domestic product, which does get people's attention.
One of the, we've had a lot of questions come in through social media, and a theme that keeps coming up in the questions presented through social media is, how do you engage men and boys? So we're talking a little bit about that, and maybe, Phumzile, you could mention some of the things that UN Women is doing to engage men and boys on these issues.
Yeah. I just want, though, to touch on the issue of cultural norms. it's very important to push for legislative reforms, because legislation creates a barrier and a possibility for recourse. Where you have legislation that stops discriminating, the people who are prejudiced may not, if they are racist or sexist, they may not necessarily love black people or women, but the law will stop them from abusing those people without fear of any reprisals. So laws are very important, and that is why the normative agenda, those of us who operate in that area, is an important instrument to sort of provide a base for many of the other programmatic work that we do. On the issue of men and boys, we have a campaign which we call He for She, which we launched together on International Women's Day, where we are actually saying we need men to stand up on the right side of history. It is half of the population, half of population on Earth, half of humanity. If you do not engage men and boys, we risk leaving out such an important constituency and people who are active in actually perpetrating, even though there's a lot of good men, especially in this room, you risk, sorry.
I was just going to say thank you.
So we need to make sure that we create a platform for men and boys to also express their feelings and to win them over. In the He and She campaign, we ask men to upload themselves on our digital media, explaining what they understand by gender inequality and what men should do. Because then we generate that information throughout the system so that other men can actually learn and use those examples. But also we encourage them to take offline activities, because online activities can actually make people not do the real thing. People must, after pressing a button, go and change legislation in their company. They must go to their community and call a meeting. They must go and fight a case that discriminates. You need them to go beyond doing things online. And we're trying to mobilize, hopefully, like 1 billion men to take a stand.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah. We collaborate very closely with Phumzile and UN Women, and we're going through a reorganization here at the World Bank, and really one of the very top reasons for that reorganization is that we want to be able to capture all of the greatest innovations, for example, in involving men and boys. Now, when I was in my previous job at Dartmouth, we had a problem throughout the United States and the world of sexual violence on campuses. And so what we did was we said, gosh, is there anything we can do? And when we really started looking, there were examples of successful programs you never would have predicted would be successful. There was real data. And so one of the things that we have to do, and we'll do this together, is, of course, present the data on how important it is, and how widespread it is and how important it is to stop, for example, violence against women. But then we have to put in front of all of these countries successful examples so that they cannot say, well, this is something that goes back 100 years in history, nothing can be done about it. If we can be explicit about the interventions, the innovative approaches that have actually worked, then we increase the pressure for them to at least try to do something. And of course, because we can show later that this helps, this boosts economic growth, I think we'll have a strong case.
I do want to underscore, though, what Phumzile said about changing laws. As you heard in the summary that Jenny gave, there are still so many laws on the books that limit what women can do, what kind of jobs they can hold, whether they can own property, whether they can inherit property, all kinds of restrictions. And there needs to be a concerted effort to reach out to parliamentarians and other decision makers and influential leaders in societies for them to champion these changes. Now, you may not get them at first, but you have to keep going back time and time again, and you build a broader base of support. Because the laws help to delegitimize certain behavior, not that it eliminates it, because we have, made great strides in this country over the last 20 plus years in the violence against women efforts, because we had laws, and then we had services, and then we had training programs, because very often the principal problems were the police and the judges, who themselves didn't take it seriously and didn't want to interfere with domestic family disputes. So slowly but surely you built up a cadre of people who could change behaviors, but it would not have happened and the resources would not have followed absent the legal changes that were brought about over years of lobbying and enlisting all kinds of support, not just inside legislatures, but more broadly in society.
Just picking up on that issue about laws, there is a convention, a UN convention, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. And I wonder if you can comment, both Secretary Clinton and Phumzile, on how you have seen CEDAW used and what you would like to see going forward in terms of CEDAW implementation.
Implementation, implementation, implementation. Because be it CEDAW and the other policies, laws that we have, where sometimes we are seriously compromised is in the implementation. And I just don't think that it is in the area of addressing gender equality, but in many other cases, the shortage of practice and theory of implementation is a serious challenge that we face, those of us who work with governments. And I think we need to invest in the same way that we invested in the theory of change. And I think most of us now can really follow through, produce data and so on. There's room for us to do something about implementation. CEDAW, where countries report, where we are able to go back to them, where we've got data to show where they are lacking, you are able to move a little bit. But I just think that when we are in multilateral institutions, we need to move closer to implementation without taking over, because you also want countries to own their own work and their own progress.
Well, of course, the United States is not a party, but we have certainly tried to implement the spirit of CEDAW over time. But I think it raises a larger issue about implementation. Lots of countries have passed CEDAW and nothing has changed. And it comes down to a kind of box-checking exercise. Oh, can we say that we're in favor of the rights of women, ending violence against women, the whole list? Well, yes, we'll pass this very important UN covenant, and we've done all we need to do. And of course, that is far from adequate, as we've just heard. Part of what we're trying to do in the lead up to 2015 and the 20th anniversary of the 4th Women's Conference in Beijing, working together, is to really carefully analyze and produce a comprehensive review about where we are and where we're falling short, where the gaps are. That's the work I'm doing at the Clinton Foundation and our No Ceilings initiative, working with a number of partners to try to put together a very comprehensive analysis of the data that we do have and what the gaps are. And this is a full court press. I mean, UN Women, World Bank, all of us together, because we need an overall single place for people to go to see what we've achieved and where we fall short. So, for example, we will, have a list of what countries have ratified CEDAW and then compare it to where they stand, giving the tools for groups within those countries as well as outside pressure to say, well, you adopted this, but you haven't made progress in comparison to other countries. But it's that kind of strong foundational base on which we then can target follow-up actions. Actions aimed at governments, actions aimed at social actors, civil society, and the like, and draw more comparisons. And so I think that this is a perfect example where a lot of countries have ratified it, and in some of those countries it has served as a great implementing device, other countries, not much has happened. What's the difference? How do we find what the common strains are that brought about implementation, and then be pushing those so that we are measuring and motivating based on the data that we have?
What are some of the other areas that you're measuring, the gaps in your No Ceilings initiative?
Well, we're looking across the board at the full participation agenda of the Platform for Action that came out of Beijing. That was such a historic document. I mean, people who are younger look at me a little blankly when I talk about Beijing and I talk about the Platform for Action, but 189 countries came together in adopting this Platform for Action, and it was a platform for action to achieve the full participation of women. Now, we've made progress in health and education. Maternal mortality is down, primary education is up, secondary education, we have a ways to go. But there are certain areas that were called for in terms of action, such as political and economic activity and participation, peace and security, for example. And we just haven't made sufficient progress in those areas. So we want to look at where we have moved toward the full participation agenda, and exactly the point that was made, how the Millennium Development Goals and the Beijing Platform for Action have converged and where they haven't. And as we look at the data that's available and we draw up the comparisons, we want funders and institutions to pay particular attention to those areas where we haven't made enough progress. And political participation and economic participation, participation in the civil lives of countries on voice and agency, as well as peace and security, just haven't made as much progress as health and education.
One of the very strong themes of this publication is the role of economic opportunity, really creating voice and agency for women. And I wonder if you can talk about the bank's objectives in creating economic opportunities for women, because it is one of the areas that really has lagged.
You know, we're looking at all levels of what it means to have economic opportunity. For example, on the most simple level, 2.5 billion people don't have access to financial services. In other words, they don't have bank accounts, they can't save. And the majority of those who don't have access are women. So just getting access to financial services will be an important step. And then the next step is access to capital. I had this great experience of going to China, and with the support of IFC, we helped a Chinese bank set up a branch in Sichuan that was specifically for women. And so I went and saw these incredible success stories where we made an extra effort to ensure that women had access to capital. And they're starting from there, and you continue. We're working on a program with Goldman Sachs to teach entrepreneurship skills, and we just increased the investment in that program. You know, there's this great story. There's a woman named Buki who came here to visit. She's a Nigerian pharmacist. And when we met her, she had a couple of pharmacies and she wanted to expand. And so we had invested in a local bank that made loans to people who were doing these really small businesses. She then grew to 17 pharmacies, 25 pharmacies. She's putting in place 20 more this year. And she's now one of the largest growing businesses. And she never would have had that access to capital to do that if we had not specifically said that our money and our efforts are going to go to give women access to capital. And then, you know, with the Goldman Sachs program, entrepreneurial skills. And so every step of the way, that's what it means for us to be mindful of gender, is that we're going out and saying, are there very concrete, specific things that we can do to provide women access to economic opportunity? And again, the good news is that there's so many good examples. Now our job is to put these in front of everybody and say, don't you want to do something like this, because it's going to be good for everybody.
I just couldn't agree with Jim more on the issue of financial inclusion. The work that IFC and Goldman Sachs is doing, for instance, extending the capacity to take money to women. In addition to just having the money available for women, financial literacy for women is very important. Encouraging the culture of savings is very important, and protecting the rights of women to own their money. Because we could do all of these things, and then in South Africa we call that dairy robbery. Because in my country, sometimes the women, they keep the money, sorry to this, in the bra. So when the men take away the money, we call that dairy robbery, because it's a dairy. And so you have got to address all of these things. A classical bank may not have the capacity to do all of these things. That is why the collaboration between formal banks and civil society is crucial, so that civil society can address some of these soft issues that can actually deter a good service such as an initiative of the IFC or Goldman Sachs from reaching its intended consequences. These collaborations become very dynamic, and we all get to close the loop in the full value chain.
And one thing too, we have to look at those areas of participation that were either non-existent or extremely underdeveloped back in '95. Obviously, if you talk about voice, it's hard to imagine having a voice these days if you have no access to mobile technology, if you don't have access to the internet. You've got to be a digital citizen. And so many of these changes have occurred relatively quickly. Women still are at a great disadvantage when it comes to access, even to SMS technology, let alone smartphones. And they are much less likely to be on the internet, have access to internet. So we have to think about voice and agency in 21st century terms as we look at what has been accomplished and the gaps about where we need to go.
Women are hindered in their access to these new technologies, but they are gaining some access to these new technologies. And are you hopeful that this will really drive change, whether it's access to financial services without having to walk, hours to get to a physical bank, but to be able to bank on your phone, or access through SMS to markets that women, because they have less access, less mobility, some of these things will actually jumpstart the change in the norms that we're talking about and access to economic opportunities. Do you see that happening?
Well, we do see that happening, and we just need to, as we've said before on other issues, see what works and do more of it, try to bring it to scale. We already know that access to mobile banking is a tremendous benefit, not only to women, to men as well. And it is something that the more we can do of it, the better. I think that internet access is going to require investments from both the public and the private sector working together. But I know that Jim has done some work on this at the World Bank because we see it as a great opportunity. It's one of those leapfrog opportunities that we would like to see invested in.
But I would just add that I think that it would be a mistake for all of us to think that increased access to technology will naturally reduce gender equality. I think we have to be very vigilant in ensuring that when we put services in place or when we make investments, that we, again, just ask ourselves the question, will there be equal access? Or are there innovative approaches that even in situations where women traditionally have not had access, for example, to information technology, are there examples elsewhere in the world where they've been successful? And can we then spread those kinds of great innovations? We know that it can, there's no question, we can leapfrog generations of bad practice. But again, I would just say that you have to put a gender lens on just about everything, or else existing inequalities may rear up again.
And I couldn't agree more. I spent the last 4 years studying the use of mobile technology in poor communities, both the access, affordability, and the buy-in that you have in communities. One of the most important things that we mustn't do is to make technology a panacea for very big problems. Because if you've got significantly disadvantaged community, you cannot have a mobile phone turn around the fortunes of a poor community and then think that we are multi-device users, most of us. We take a very poor community, we think that by using a single device, 2G for that matter in some cases, can actually bring them to the same speed as all of us. That is needed because it broadens access, it deepens access, but we still need to do all these other things that we need to do in order to support. Content must be right, and all of this. We talk about access anywhere, anytime. If people don't have access to devices, yes, technology provides access anywhere, anytime, but if you don't have a device, that's just theory. So there's just some painful steps at a policy level, and also role of private sector in making some of these services and designs available so that they respond to the needs of society. But when we fill all these gaps, we definitely can make a significant impact. I experienced it in the communities that I was working in, where we were trying to use technology.
Secretary Clinton, you mentioned education as one of the big gains since Beijing, and it has been. You've seen gender gaps in many countries actually eliminated, and in some cases you've seen girls now outnumber boys in school. And yet, even in countries where women are graduating in much higher numbers than men from, say, university, you still see a lack of voice and agency. So education, of course, is necessary but not sufficient. What do you see as the most important next step in education, in global education? I'd love all of you to comment on that.
Well, I think there are two different big problems. One is we've done well with primary education, but we haven't cracked the code on secondary education in too many places. And some of those go back to the point Jim was making earlier. We need to find out what's working. If giving girls bicycles so that they can more safely get to secondary schools is working, that's a pretty inexpensive intervention that might have a big payoff. So we still have much more to do on secondary education, and then of course into higher education. On the higher education piece, again, I think you're looking at norms because even in our country, we have more young women in higher education, more young women graduating, but that isn't necessarily demonstrated in equal wages for equal work. It's not demonstrated in high-level positions in the private sector or even the public sector. So there still is much more work to be done to translate a woman's achievement on the higher education into equal job opportunities and status and achievement for herself personally as well as the enterprise. So that's one of the other mysteries that people are tackling. Like, what is it you have to do to clear the way? And we see, particularly in our country, in the technology sector, in the so-called STEM subjects, that we're actually going backwards. We had more young women graduating with degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics 30 years ago than we do today. And part of it is the unwelcoming atmosphere that those professions are offering, and the way young women are made to feel as outliers, unwelcome, not given the same opportunities. And so we have to go back at it, just constantly pushing to get those doors open and then encourage young women to take the risk and go through them.
Well, education is not a silver bullet, but it's the closest thing we have to a silver bullet. So it gives us a lot of advantage, more than many other things that we have tried as societies. And the nice thing about education is that you do not have to compete. You provide it to a class and a group of people, and everybody can benefit equally. One of the things, though, that we have to emphasize is the importance of quality. Access alone does not give us, especially at the early ages, the importance of qualities, and therefore investing in teacher training and making teacher training institutions to focus on quality, as well as ensuring that we eliminate stereotyping amongst the teachers. Because the worst thing that we can also do is to unleash teachers who are prejudiced to unsuspecting children, because then you recreate generations of girls who are not assertive. And that is why even when girls do better, they still do not aspire to get into higher position. I mean, you have seen a situation where they say that when a young man applies for a job and they look at what is needed, they will see that they can meet after the criteria. They will think, I'll apply for it and I'll talk my way in the half. The girl will want to make sure that you meet every criteria. If you don't meet 20%, you don't even start to apply. So the education must prepare girls to feel so strong and so confident about themselves so that they can actually go take their chances as well and learn on the job. And that means investing on the teachers, that means investing on the curriculum and teacher training, that means investing on good ministers of education, and so on.
You know, there's something really wonderful happening throughout all of the work we do here at the World Bank Group around the basic issue of gender equality, for example, but also in health and education. It used to be, 20 years ago, when I was in the streets in Washington, D.C., protesting against the World Bank, the protests were that we, as an institution at that time, were focused too much on pure GDP growth and not enough on investing in people. But we've changed completely because the evidence has changed. 24% of all economic growth in developing countries from 2000 to 2011 was because of better health outcomes. We now know that among the very best investments we can make is in girls' education, but again, not just in basic education, all the way through. And we also know that performance on the OECD's PISA test is now directly linked to economic growth. So improving the quality of education, but especially, again, making sure that you're going the extra mile to include women in science education. At Dartmouth, we had one of the very first women in science programs, and it made a huge difference. We're the only engineering school among our peer institutions that has 50% of the students being women, and it's because we actively recruited them. So I think there are clearly things that can be done, but it won't happen unless we set out as a goal that we're going to ensure that women participate in the full range of education and that we're going to step up and provide better quality.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to finish asking each of you the same question, and Secretary Clinton, we'll start with you. Having been such a powerful voice at Beijing, here we are in 2014. Do you look back and feel proud of all the gains and hopeful about the future? Or do you look around and say, gosh, I can't believe we're still talking about all these same issues that we were at Beijing? I mean, how do you weigh the scales, and how do you look at this issue going forward? Because I think people often feel kind of depressed when they read the headlines about women and girls around the world, and yet I'm really curious to see your No Ceilings product, because there is a lot of good news, but undeniably there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So how do you think about this going forward?
Well, I think of it as the glass half full, because I do think that we have seen significant progress. Some of that progress is in actual accomplishments, some of which we've been talking about, for example, education. And some of it is in raising awareness, getting the debate much more broadly engaged in across the world. So I'm grateful for what we have achieved, but I'm also very impatient because every year that has gone by, the argument to me has become even clearer as to why we need to move on this full participation agenda. And I am increasingly impatient with leaders who willfully ignore the injustice that accompanies the subjugation of women and the upsides of change for them and for their societies. So it certainly is mixed, but as I say, I think the glass is half full, but it does just spur me, and I think all of us here, on to even greater efforts and to be more explicit. So the UN created UN Women. It did so because it had to recognize that women were being shortchanged by the United Nations in light of what we know and what we should be focusing on. The World Bank is focusing on gender equality because it now sees it as part of its overall mission. So I think that we're in the midst of a lot of continuing change. So yes, be impatient, don't be discouraged. Just enlist more and more people in this very noble effort, make the case, and I think history's on our side.
The glass is half full. I also agree. I also know that we have so much information, even though we still have gaps in the data, but there's enough for us to make bold decisions. I would say education is probably one where bold decisions, and we know that if we make bold decisions and we partner, we can push forward the agenda very far. So to take the glass much higher, it is going to be because we partner. There is also the challenge of the gender funding gap. The discrimination against women goes even to the extent that even though we know that the biggest violations that the world faces now are committed against women, human rights violations, the funding that goes towards women, especially directly to women's organizations, from UN Women to grassroots women's organization, it's much less to the money that goes to general, broad fighting for the same issues that we would want women to win on. So there's also the need to walk the talk as much as possible in the transformation that we're talking about. And lastly, the very important challenge is also to fight impunity. Because as we make this progress, there's also a lot of people who are daring us. Look at what Boko Haram has done. It's actually daring not just the people of Nigeria, but the whole world. We're taking these girls, we're doing these atrocious things, and so what? And the fact that we do not have a situation where the whole world is at a standstill when something happens makes you feel, have we really moved that far? That the whole world does not feel that the life of the girl is the most precious thing? That when something like that happens, everybody has got to take notice and rush and make and see what we could do. So it's half-filled, there's a lot of work to be done, and we have to fight impunity. Thanks.
So I would say that the glass is half full, but we won't be able to fill the rest of the glass unless we make really concrete plans to do it. And we hold ourselves accountable by continuing to collect data. You know, I just flew in this morning actually from Germany, where yesterday we spent half a day with Chancellor Merkel. And it reminded me that, that women are now and will continue to become heads of state of some of the most powerful countries in the world. And on that note, I just want to send a message as the token male on the panel. I just want to send a message to my fellow males in the world that we should not be afraid of a future of greater gender equality. It's going to be better for all of us. We have the numbers, we have the evidence, and we know that gender equality will create a virtuous cycle where there will be increased prosperity. Now, one of my heroes, Martin Luther King, once said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And I just want to remind everybody that it doesn't bend toward justice, as he showed us in his life, unless you grab the arc of history and bend it toward justice. I am so honored to be on a panel with two women who've done that their whole lives. And I would just end by saying, we're so glad that you've come. And to fill the rest of that glass, every single one of us is going to have to commit to this agenda of voice and agency and gender equality. Thanks very much.
much. This was absolutely terrific. Thank you, Secretary Clinton. Thank you, President Kim. Thank you, Phumzile. This is just a fantastic way to end. My glass is half full, certainly, and I really do believe that this is the issue of the 21st century, and I feel so proud and encouraged that you three amazing people are behind it. So thank you all.